People always ask, what do I do with all this whey, this leftover whey? The answer is you make the most delicious cheese. I guess I say most cheeses are the most delicious. You make the incredible cheese called ricotta. Ricotta. You take that whey and you ricotta it. You recook it a second time. So you saw the whey that was generated from the cheddar jack recipe. We took that whey, poured it into a big pot. Here it is. I've turned the heat on and I've held the heat at high. What I'm looking for is to heat the whole vat. You can see. I want to heat it up to about 160, and then I'm going to do one thing, and then I'm going to heat it up to 195, and ricotta will form. So let me take a temperature. 156, 157, 158. Let me give it one more minute. I'll use that time to explain a little distinction in ricotta or ricotta. There is whey ricotta, which is the true authentic ricotta, recooked, uses the byproduct, the whey, from the cheese making process. Whey ricotta. Most ricotta, however, today that you find in the supermarket, it's not so much made with whey. It's oftentimes made with milk. It's made with whole milk. You see whole milk ricotta sold in Italian delis in tins where the tops are piled up like snow cones. That's whole milk ricotta. Both of them are delicious. Both are called ricotta, but I find both of them quite different. Whey ricotta is got more of a caramel flavor, yellower color, and more of a cooked flavor. Whole milk ricotta tends to have more of a fresh white cheese texture to it. So it's a little bit firmer and has more of a milky smell. What you'll find is that many people, many professional cheesemakers, they make a ricotta somewhere in the middle. They'll use the leftover whey from a day's cheese make, but they'll add in some whole milk, so it'll become a hybrid of the two. This recipe here is pure whey ricotta. I am going to add a tiny bit of cream to you just because I had it left over in the fridge, but it still is whey ricotta. Let me check the temperature. I can smell the change. It's starting to smell. Do you know when you make a cappuccino and you have the foaming milk, and the foaming milk makes that kind of sweet caramelized smell? That's what I'm smelling here at the vat. So 160, 161. I'm going to go ahead and add two things. About a quarter cup of milk or cream. It's not that important. What this does is just kind of helps to catalyze the precipitation of the whey proteins. So I often add a little bit of whey or a little bit of cream. Cream obviously makes it richer. Stir that in. It's important to not add any additional whey or cream until the temperature of the vat has crossed over 160 Fahrenheit. That's because the rennet that we added in the cheddar recipe, the rennet is still active, and so you have to wait till heat deactivates the rennet. Then you can add other ingredients such as milk or cream. Again, I'm just going to do ballpark estimates because it's hard to say exactly the quantity, the volume of whey that you get out of a cheese recipe. Sometimes it'll be a little bit more, sometimes it'll be a little bit less. The other thing I'm going to add when I'm adding the cream and the milk is I'm going to go ahead and add some salt. I like to, for this volume, which is about 3 gallons, I like to add about 1.5 tablespoons per gallon. So I'll do 4 tablespoons, 4.5 tablespoons. A little bit more. Stir in the salt. And just a reminder, I've got the heat on high. I really want to get the temperature up quickly. Unlike the other cheese making recipes where we grow very gradually from 86 degrees to 95 degrees, this one we're going really hot and we really want to get there, so the temperature is quite hot. I'll put the lid on to help. When the pot reaches between 190 and 195, I'm going to add a modest amount of acid. I can add the acid in the form of white vinegar, or I can add the acid in the form of citric acid. Today I have some citric acid. It's in crystal form, so I'm going to dissolve it in some water before adding it. Here's a little bit of water, like a quarter cup of room temperature water. I'm going to start off with a really modest amount of acid, citric acid. I'm going to add a quarter of a teaspoon. If I was going to add white vinegar, I would start off with adding about a quarter of a cup. So that's a quarter teaspoon citric acid crystals dissolved into about a quarter cup of room temperature water. The interesting thing about making whey ricotta is that you don't always have to add acid, and this is why. When I, several hours ago, put bacteria into the milk, my cultures, my buttermilk, my MM100, my Flora Danica, I was introducing bacteria into the milk. What the bacteria do is they digest the lactose and they create lactic acid. That's why you keep seeing me sniff the pot, smelling that lactic smell, that yogurty smell. If I wait long enough after moving the curds, the cheddar curds, out of the vat, if I wait long enough, the whey that's left behind will become quite acidic on its own, because the bacteria that I added earlier are still there and they're still eating the lactose, still creating lactic acid. So here's the point. The longer you wait before making the ricotta, the less acid that you add when the whey hits 190, 195. Does that make sense? Okay, let me check the temperature. We're just about 170, 20 more degrees. Can you see the foam that's forming? It's one of my favorite smells. Okay, going back to this idea of how much acid to add to the whey ricotta. Professionally, if I was making this cheese commercially, I wouldn't have to do a guessing game of wondering how much to add. I would just use a pH meter and I would see how acidic the whey had become and then judge how much additional acid I had to add, if any at all. So that's how you do it commercially. On the home scale, this is what I do. I don't wait long before finishing the cheese recipe, the cheddar, the Gouda, the Havarti, the Gruyere, and taking that whey, moving it onto the stove and starting the whey ricotta. In fact, you don't really have that much time. If you wait 3 hours and it's a hot day, those bacteria that are the cultures in the whey, they're gonna go, create so much acid that you actually can't get any ricotta to come out of the whey at all. So you have a little bit of a window. We'll say if you make it right away, immediately after, you're good, all the way up to about 3 hours. After that time, the whey just has to go to another purpose. Like you could throw it in the garden, or maybe you could use some sour whey as a stock base, or maybe you could get your pet to eat it. Pigs would love it. There's many different ways you could use it. Throw it into pancakes or other baked goods. You could also throw it away. You won't be, no one will look down upon you. It's a long day of cheese making to add an additional couple of hours making the whey into ricotta. That's a lot. The temperature is rising. Let's see where we're at now on this vat of ricotta. Remember, we've only added a little bit of cream and a little bit of salt. We still have to add the acid. $183. 184. What's kind of amazing, if you can see it, is the cheese is already wanting to form. Can you see that? Like little clouds. It's worth getting your nose right in there because it's amazing. Like clouds that are forming over the surface. When I see this cloud formation over the surface before it hits 190, that tells me we already have a good amount of acid in there, because the acid is what's going to cause the cheese to precipitate out of the broth, and it's already happening. So that tells me those cultures, those bacteria from hours ago have done their work. I might not even plan to add all that acid, the 1/4 teaspoon of citric acid that I dissolved in water. I'm going to just plan to add half of it based on how this cheese looks at 182. If you're unsure and you just want to stick to a decided quantity of acid, that's okay. You can add the entire 1/4 teaspoon of citric acid. That will get you going, starting to understand the whey ricotta recipe. With time, though, you'll realize you can actually add less and less acid, which will yield you a sweeter and more tender ricotta. So for your first run of the recipe, just give yourself space and forgiveness. Learn how whey ricotta is made. Then, as you make it again and again, learn how to step back, how to taper off the amount of acid that you're adding. Let's check the temperature. 187. We're getting close. You can tell this ricotta wants to form. So here we are, a few more degrees, 2 more degrees. But look at this. It's like this cloud of sweet, tender curds that is gathered at the top. Can you see as I pull gently away, there's more and more and more? My little tiny drop of acid is just going to let that last bit of whey protein precipitate out. So we'll get a little bit of a higher yield by adding a little bit of acid. However, we barely need to add it. And I'm saying that based on how translucent the whey now is. That tells me that most of the cheese that was in that milk is already right here or in the cheddar wheel. I'd said that we can add the acid between 190 and 195. We're at 190 now. We're at 190. So I'm going to go ahead and add half the acid. This is usually a really fun moment of cheese making. A little bit of acid and I'm going to stir it abruptly. And I'm going to stop the motion of the liquid. And you can see it's just filling up the surface, clouding up the surface. And now I'm ready for my last step, which is I want to just let this surface curd cook. It's going to become firmer and firmer. And then at some point, the pressure below, because it's gotten hot enough below, is going to erupt the surface open. At that point, I'm going to turn off the heat, let it sit in the hot whey, the ricotta sit in the hot whey for 5-10 minutes, and then I'm going to drain it into a draining basket. Here's a traditional ricotta basket. Drain it into a basket, and it's ready to eat. You could eat it hot, although it's probably nice to let it cool down to room temperature. The thing about ricotta, both the whole milk ricotta and whey ricotta, has a very short shelf life. Commercially, when we make it in very sterile conditions, and we pack it into tubs. We use a nitrogen gas flush. We keep everything extremely clean. Homemade ricotta or small-scale ricotta, you've got all this exposure right now to yeast in the air, bacteria on your skin, so it's just going to have a shorter shelf life. Just good to know, plan to eat it within 3 to 5, maybe even 3 to 4 days. The fresher it is, the more delicious. Now I'm just looking for that surface to burst open, and then I'm going to turn the heat off. Also, note, I'm not stirring after I added that acid. I stirred the acid in, and then I stopped stirring. That's because if I kept stirring, these particles wouldn't be able to clump together and form distinct curds that stay within the basket. it would break them up and they would slip out of the basket. Suspense. I can watch on temperature too. I find that that eruption usually happens around, right around the boiling point, 210. Few more degrees. So I've let the ricotta curds sit in the hot whey for about 10 minutes. During that time, they've cooked just a little bit more, which helps them be firm enough so that when I ladle them into the cheese form, they don't just slip through the cracks. If you leave the ricotta longer than 10 minutes, no problem, but at some point you're kind of defeating the purpose of collecting the ricotta because it's going to be cold and it won't knit together and form a nice pretty cheese shape that when you invert the cheese form. So to collect the ricotta, this is my favorite spoon to use, and what I do is I just go below the surface. There's basically a cheese cloud floating on the top of this vat. And I'm just going to ladle that so gently into my cheese form. This is my favorite ricotta of the two options there are. I want to let the ricotta drain long enough that it's dried out a little bit, like 10 minutes. If you want a drier ricotta, like one that you could pipe into a cannoli shell and it's not going to make the shell soggy, I would let the ricotta drain much longer. Like you could let it drain, you know, sit it in a colander, wrap it in a plastic bag, put it in the fridge overnight. You'll have very, very well drained ricotta, so thick and so stiff you could mortar a wall with it. If I let it drain just 10 minutes or 20 minutes and then I transfer it, say, to a nice glass container that won't melt, it's going to be way, 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 way lighter and more moist. So you just have to decide what are you going to use the ricotta for, and then from there go on to decide how long you want to let it drain. Before I finish up with the ricotta recipe, I just want to make one other comment. Something that just never ceases to amaze me is the color of this whey which is left behind after I've gathered both the wheel of cheese and now the ricotta out of it. It's kind of like bright lime green. And I always think about, what is the goal of cheese making? Like, what are we even doing? How did it come about? And when I think about it, and I want to whittle it down to the simplest way to describe cheese making. I think of cheese making as getting the water out of the milk and saving the non-water part of the milk, the solids. This is what our ancient ancestors were doing. They were getting the water, this stuff, which though it's bright green, it's also amazingly transparent because we've removed a ton of the stuff that was in it out. Our ancestors, they are the ones that realized that walking around with a big bulky bag of milk wasn't anywhere as efficient as getting the water out and walking around with the dehydrated curds. So we are returning now to our farmer's cheese recipe. This is, again, an excellent, easy cheese that I think you're going to make. It's that easy. Yesterday, we took this gallon of milk that was room temperature and we added buttermilk to it to start the fermentation process, to start the breakdown of the lactose in the milk by the bacteria in the cultured buttermilk.